All right, here we go. I assume that folks can hear me, correct? Okay. Good morning to you all. My name's Jim Tischler. I run the development operations for the uh, state of Michigan Land Bank Authority. I'm in the process of getting my presentation up to go here for you. There we go. Is that visible to everyone? Okay, good. I see Manny shaking your head. I'm going to follow your trust there. So this presentation this morning is going to focus on is the first of a two-part a series that over the next today and a week from today, of which request to build Maine. I'm more than pleased to share with you some of these elements of land banks, land banking basics, and back to what we'll talk next week on is how it can be put to productive, effective use for redevelopment and recycling of land parcels. Many of the slides in this presentation were presented in a webinar that was given on December 6th of last year. I received, and I think Bill Maine received a number of requests. Can you do that again? So here we are today. Again. This slide presentation is going to take, actually I should back up. There are a few additional slides I put in here to provide more baseline background information for you about what we're talking about with land banks and land banking. So for those of you who were there and have looked at the December 6th presentation, you're going to get a few additional new items today. But again, this is leading towards a next step to talk about putting it to productive into proactive reuse. Here's what we'll cover today, to which I would describe it to be land banking version 1.0. The key sections are going to be talking about domicology. Now, your first question might be, what the heck is that? Okay. In a brief description, it is the nascent and growing scientific research of the life cycle of the built environment and structures within. Talk about more of that as we get into slides. But that the understanding of how buildings go through life cycle and built environment properties go through life cycle is critical to then understand or learn how land banks and land banking operates, because they fit a role which is critical, but to the recent time not well understood, which is what happens when the market fails to pick up and address issues that lead to distress on properties. So the next section in this presentation will be a brief on what land banks are, followed then by why they are necessary to address some of those systemic failures or problems which occur with distress and other factors related to property within a domicological cycle. How are they organized will come next, because this movement, which has now in recent times approximately 15 years old, but at a larger scale is more like 50 years old. There are various structures, processes, and mechanics of how they have become organized. The next discussion topic will be what can they do? In other words, what their powers, and more importantly, what they cannot do. Now, interspersed within these slides, you're going to see a few technical items, but my word to you today is do not worry, because I will explain. And if you have questions, of course, you can chat them into Mandy, and Mandy will share them with me. And I'll be happy to answer those questions to the extent that I can during the course of the presentation. Now, down in the lower right, quick star for you. We'll talk about this at the end of today's session. But next Thursday, we will continue this conversation with a 2.0 discussion to build upon what we covered today. Okay. All right, let's move on. This is a critical, which most people going through their daily lives don't really recognize, because we live our daily lives. I guess it's kind of indoors right now, but we're living our daily lives, and we don't realize that in fact, land, whether it's parcelized land or open space tracts, is the first resource that supports human activity. Meaning, whether we are engaged in social activities or economic activities, physiological activities, or ecological activities across the four major realms, a critical, and I would submit the most critical element, is because we are terrestrial beings. The land that we act on and proact on is that first resource. It seems to just fade into the background because we are busy people doing things on an everyday basis. But it's important that that be recognized, because buildings and structures upon land, wherever we are located and whatever we are doing, and incorporating all of the various specific technical aspects, structures have life cycle. That is another basic tenet of this budding science now called domicology. And if we accept that terminology and that recognition that buildings and structures go through a life cycle, then we can then understand that that life cycle has a wide variation. If you have been to historic sites, whether on the North American continent or Europe or other places, you are looking and you have had the benefit of seeing structures and built form neighborhoods that have existed perhaps for hundreds or even thousands of years. Those sites are actually going through their life cycle as well, but through combination of maintenance, redevelopment, reconstruction, and such, those societies, those markets address to extend the life cycle of structures and neighborhoods in good built form as it goes. But where there are factors of distress, and when there are multiple factors of distress, and they could come from other angles, those factors have the potential to disrupt that life cycle, or effectively to shorten that life cycle. And we can think of some of those examples here in the United States in some of our urban centers where, for various reasons, that progression has accelerated to what you see in this slide here, which could be or would be that privately owned properties, for one or more reasons, become vacant, become abandoned. They move towards they move towards even dereliction. That cycle of acceleration continues, which leaves the community, aka the government, with a burden of trying to need to address those situations, whether it's through demolitions, clearance, or other factors, all necessary to set the stage for a redevelopment context. And I'll ask you to think about that from a cycle standpoint, a systematic cycle standpoint, because that sets the stage for us understanding now how land banks exist, they are needed, and how they fill a real big gap. Because these next slides, although they are in Michigan, I would bet if I had all of you in a room talking to you, what I often do in my presentations is go through a hand raising exercise. So I can't see you, but you can raise your hand if you want, if you have a site that looks like this in or near your neighborhood or in your community. I will bet almost all of you are raising, thank you, Andy, all of you are raising your hands. And so, because these exist, and think about it from a cycle or systematic basis, one or more distress factors have led towards an acceleration of the life cycle, leading to the condition we have. Here's another example. If you have, by the way, if you had the first one, you can keep your right hand raised. And if you have this, something that looks like this, now you can raise your left hand, because I'll bet most of you have something that looks like this. Now, we have called these sites brownfields. Yes, correct. But I'm going to continue to ask you to think of it from a holistic, systematic standpoint, of which brownfield, in other words, contamination, is but one of multiple distress factors which affect properties. Here's another example. Now, if you raised your right and left hand on the first two slides, you can now raise your right foot, although I can't see you. All right. You probably, if you have a property that looks like this, or if you have a property that looks like this. If you are coming from a rural place, you might have a vacant property or property which was demolished with leaving it wide open for development. So again, I can't see you, but I'll bet you that at least half of you probably have both your hands and both your toes raised right now, because you know these sites, these properties are in your community. And the next question that comes is, what's being done about them? Okay. Most often, not much. And it's because our system, our structure of development and guidance and planning and zoning and enforcement often has gaps that come about because of the multiple factor distress elements that arise with these properties. Therefore, they have accelerated in their domicological life cycle stage. So I've just identified a few of these physical distress factors to land: contamination or blight or obsolescence. What does that mean? Obsolescence means that a structure, it exists on a property, but it cannot perform at any level the function for which it was originally intended, right? There could be market demand factors. There could be other factors that relate to distress as well. But you'll note that I have screened the number one reason in Jim Tischler's opinion and in some practitioners, and it's because of this. If you assume that you can address the one or more physical factors related to the property, in other words, the government or some other source comes in to address the contamination or blight or obsolescence or other issues, more and more often, the number one factor relies or focuses on having clear title to the property. Because if I had that property and I decided to walk away from it, and Mandy wanted to acquire the property because it was abandoned, if I didn't make a specific disposition, say for just walking away for the property, then I have a identified interest in the title. So when Mandy wants to go to the bank to get a loan to new build or rehab that house or that building, the first thing the bank's going to say is, well, as part of the loan, I want you to deliver to me a clear title commitment for the property. And when she can't do that because there's not just Jim Tischler, but maybe 3 or 4 other people's interest still in that title, that presents not necessarily, it's a physical, but it's also a documentary factor that relates to distress on the property as well. And starting in the late 60s and accelerating through into the 90s and in the aughts, this rose to become one of, if not the top issue, in combination with the other factors leading to abandonment and blight. So land banks, that was the opening for land banks to grow from the concept that they came from about 50 years ago. In a very summary statement, a land bank is a public, most of the time, or quasi-governmental, or in some states, community-owned enterprise that's created to effectively be a real estate entity, to acquire, to manage, maintain, or repurpose these types of abandoned or foreclosed or other distressed properties. As originally designed through pioneering efforts in some of the cities of the Northeast back 50 years ago and advanced to today, the baseline reasons for their creation are to get title and to clear title so that properties can move to productive reuse, recognizing that a land bank or an entity, a land banking entity, is never a permanent owner to property. It's an interim owner wanting to take from current or past ownership or condition to future ownership and condition.
Hey, Jim,
yes.
Just a quick question. We've been getting some statements in the chat box, but I wanted to highlight Cecilia's question about blight. What about commercial properties that have been for sale or lease for over 2 years in real estate markets that are hot, like Portland, Maine? Would you consider that a blight?
It could be. That's my answer. I'll give you a more direct definition of what I consider to be blight, which is whatever the state enabling legislation and your local ordinance or regulation determines blight is, because that's how blight is defined across all the states. Blight is a municipal property code enforcement item. As such, it's not a federal power. It's a relegated power to the states, which then provides structure through statute enabling or in Dillon rule states, provide the authority of locals to actually engage enforcement. And within that framework, that's where the legal definition of blight resides. There could be an effective definition of blight, of which one or more, many municipalities have started to define blight in terms of registries of vacant buildings and requirements to deal with conditions for vacant buildings. And that might be a scenario that the question, the question posed might be able to address, which was, what does the local jurisdiction define as a blighted situation or a vacancy situation? Note, I'll go back to a phrase that I used before. If you think of it from a systematic standpoint, a vacancy might lead to abandonment, which might lead to blight, which might lead to dereliction. And so if you think of it that way, a number of units might have started to structure backward or up chain in terms of how they define conditions of property maintenance. So on back to the slide deck, clearing clouded or encumbered property title is not the only reason. There are many other reasons you'll see for having land banks and a land banking process, but it's one of the key elements because setting up to do things still requires the legal, structural, effective capacity to actually do it. Now, as I've said a few times, this is not a new scenario, a new structure. Land banks have been around for 50 years. Date myself here. What you're seeing on this list on the left side are the dates of when states enabled, adopted legislation to enable the creation of land banks. But what you don't see here is the list of the pioneering cities that actually got into this realm probably 20 years ahead of the states doing this, namely Cleveland and St. Louis, although there are a few other communities as well. They, in the late 60s and early 70s, the concept of the pioneering was occurring for what we know now as the land banking movement. And then starting in the 90s, particularly in and around the recession, not just during the recession, but prior to the recession, that's where states began to see the need and the opportunities to actually provide structural enabling of those there. So it might be tough for you to see, but there have been three tranches or three phases of state activity surrounding land banks. Up at the top, Kentucky, which Kentucky's statute will focus just on Louisville, but that was the first state law that was adopted. And then Michigan statute came in 2003. A little bit of a break, and then some of the other states that that adopted laws came in right around the Great Recession time, as you see there in that second group of four. But what's been interesting is that since 2012, and that you can see that list going down, this movement has accelerated, and it is, you can almost see it moving from an East Coast to West Coast. Although I'll note, Portland, Oregon does have a land bank as go. So I'll talk about organization and the powers organized in a few minutes. But land banks in many states do not require state enabling legislation to be created, because the authority might already exist within the home rule or the authorized authority of a city or a county government as similar to the affairs that they regularly conduct. The last or the most recent state that adopted land banking legislation is New Jersey. I know that I have a few folks from New Jersey on this call today because they have expressed interest in wanting to better understand what's going on around the country. So congratulations, New Jersey. And I know that there are a couple other states that have some conversations going around. We expect that this list is going to grow and this movement is going to continue to expand, perhaps become more of a national construct or structure. So if we were to boil down these structures or these processes for creating land banks, Generally, as I was just alluding to, a state enabling statute often comes into play, which sets the terms, conditions, and processes for how locals can do that. However, it depends on how the state confers the powers to local units. Michigan, for example, is a home rule state. Michigan's constitution and legislature, and through legislative action, provides a large amount of authority for local units of government to conduct their own affairs, AKA home rule. A number of states, I know, for example, Vermont, and I even believe maybe Maine, I'll look for Mandy to shake your head and tell me yes or no, is what's known as a Dillon's rule state, which means that all of, nope, okay, good. Then some states have structures where the power to act locally comes on a task to task basis as empowered by the legislature and not universally like in home rule states. Two states, my home state of Michigan and Alabama, in their statutes set up a structure for a state land bank which has various authorities and powers. And I'll talk to you about what we do here in Michigan in a few moments. Okay. Now that's general. More typically, once enabled or if power is already existing, the organization of the land banks is usually at a city or sometimes a county level because that's where the activity is most likely to occur. Is that a question? Oh, okay. But many land banks, yeah, folks that have come in, I think you might want to, if you just joined the conference, you might want to go on mute just to be sure. So there's no cross sound going. So organization occurs at the city or the town or county, the local jurisdictional level. But a number of land bank state enabling statutes encourage collaboration at regional scale. It doesn't require, but encourages collaboration to go. And I've said this a couple times already, in many states, you might already have the power in your municipal's constitutional or ordinance or structure to actually create land banks right now. In Michigan, our activity occurred a little over 15 years ago, back in 2003. Where two new acts were created and amendments were made to the General Property Tax Act. The Land Bank Fast Track Act, I'll describe that in a few moments. That is the mainline enabling vehicle that authorized the creation of land banks. But a sister act set up a funding mechanism, Act 260, for land banks in Michigan. And then because land banks can and often do take properties out of the tax foreclosure process, amendments were made to the Top Property Tax Act in Michigan back then to set up the structure for entry of tax reverted properties into the land bank system at local level. Now I haven't talked too much about tax reversion because that's a whole discussion of itself, and every state is different. But the way I'll describe it generally right now is this. Most states have a structure which says if you don't pay your taxes, you go into some level of delinquency, however length of time that is, varies by state. And at some point in time, if there is no repayment of the delinquent taxes, there's a foreclosure that occurs that the government forecloses on the property for failure to pay taxes, and then the government makes a disposition of that foreclosed property. Again, it varies by state, varies by local unit. Some units decide that they're going to put it up for auction, like here in Michigan, or the option exists here in Michigan that instead of auction, they can put it into a land bank to put it to a productive reuse environment as well. I'm just describing what happened there. That system, there's a system that's in your state. It's incumbent for you to understand what that system is so that you could see, if you're interested in looking at land banking, how land banking can fit within that system, such as what I'm aware the Build Maine folks are doing right now with the state, with Maine's enabling legislation with regards to tax reversion.
Actually, Jim, that's a great segue. We just got a question on what's Maine doing about this, and yeah, is there already work happening to set up land banks? So Build Maine has started looking at this tool specifically as part of our systems change effort. We started meeting in August to look holistically at Maine's land development system to see how we could more effectively address housing, environmental, transportation, economic, and financial goals. We started by mapping our entire land use system, which can be found at our website, which is www.build-maine.com under the news tab, just for reference. And we now have a number of working groups looking at different recommendation actions, one of which is focused on land banks and is being headed up by Ian Houseal with the City of Sanford, who, if Ian, I saw you're on the line, if you want to unmute and just jump in here real quick. Say hi.
Hi. Yes, we are looking at it. We've got another number of people helping us from Shelley Norton. I see her on the call. Bangor's been participating. Also, I always bungle this name, at Northern Regional Development Corporation as well has been participating. And seeing whether we can put in place enabling legislation to facilitate it. In Sanford, we do have an operating land bank. Maine is a home rule state, and we've put one in place, and we've been running one for the last 3 years, and it's been successful, and amazing how successful it's been at turning properties that have been blighted, decrepit, and a variety of other impacts to property, land, and value, and bringing them back into productive use and increasing property values overall.
Yeah, and if anybody has any questions on this, feel free to email us at connect@build-maine.com, or you can email Ian directly if you're okay with that. Sorry to put you on the spot. If you want to put your phone number in the chat box, or excuse me, email address in the chat box. And sorry, Jim, to sort of hijack that.
Yeah, and you're welcome to email me directly. I think we're at a point, and I appreciate Jim doing this presentation today. And we've got another one I think we're talking about next Thursday as a follow-up. So some more nuts and bolts to talk about how we do this in Maine. I think we're at a point where, I think, when you say land bank, people don't always understand what that means. I'd say even putting one together, I didn't quite understand what it meant until we did it. And we're still working through the details of that. So, I think it's important to get the word out. I think it's what I'm hearing is that it's a tool that should be in the toolbox of planners and economic developers throughout the state, because we can't allow some of these properties to sit blighted and vacant for forever.
Great.
Okay, great comments. You're welcome to interject anytime. I'm aware of what the Build Maine group is doing, and I think Ian, Manny, and the team is doing really good as well. So back to the slide deck here. Now, I'm giving you some Michigan orientation here, but you could just as effectively wipe out the word Michigan and think about this generically. If there's an enabling structure, at least here, the legislative intent, those 3 bullets would be applicable anywhere, meaning that if land banking is allowed to exist in order to provide for the assembly or disposal of public properties, tax reverted properties in coordination, or to acquire, assemble, dispose, or to provide for financing, or to provide the mechanics for what we have here in Michigan as fast track title authority. What does that mean? Fast track title authority in Michigan is I'll call it a accelerated than normal process for how titles can get cleared in courts of law. Back to this issue, which is clear marketable title often presents a major obstacle before anything else can be done on a property. And so in Michigan, the legislature saw fit to provide this fast track mechanism while protecting the rights of citizens to redeem properties if they have properties. The fast track title boils down to effectively 21 days. That once the parties that are on record are notified that they have a limited period of time to come to the court and explain why they should be able to redeem the property and redeem on the spot. And if they cannot do that, then title is cleared. All interests are extinguished on the title in favor of the land bank. And so that is a very effective and critical mechanism to move property. Think about this from prior condition, which be distress, blight, whatever, contamination, obsolescence, to move into the ability to put into productive reuse because you have a clear state table in order to be able to start doing that work to move. All right. A little more advertisement for what we do here. Our inventory is a little over 2,500 parcels. Now, keep in mind, Michigan is a top 10 state in population. I think we're about 8 or 9 times the population of Maine. In the southern half of Michigan is relatively urban. The northern half is not so much. So on this map, you can see our title holdings mostly are focused in southern lower Michigan. And they spread up as you go out there as you go further upstate and outstate to go. Now, the types of properties that the state land bank gets mostly look like this. We are also the state's redevelopment agency. And so where the state of Michigan has surplus properties, which are single-use type properties like former prisons or other governmental facilities, or large brownfield sites where owners walk away, those properties usually are where we are the destination of last resort for those, or conversely, the start of repurposing and redevelopment, which is how we like to see our operations to go. So whether it's a 80-acre former prison campsite or a 200-acre multiple institutional facility like the site you see here in Wayne County, which, by the way, this site was demoed, as you can see down below. Trouble, though, is that it was, for you brownfielders out there, you'll get this. It looks like it's ready to go. I will show you a picture, except that there's a need for about $9 million of additional cleanup because the site's a fill site, okay? Those are elements of distress that in a number of areas, the local situation, the local government, the regional government, these on a scope basis, either dollar scope, size scope, activity scope, are simply too large for those locals or regional collaborations to handle. And that's a key reason for us as the state land bank in Michigan to step in, because we can bring the process and even financial resources to the state to to reset and reposition sites and move them into redevelopment settings. This is a image of a portion of a former psychiatric hospital location up in northern lower Michigan, which just so happens to be adjacent to a river course. And so these are examples of the types of properties that we get. 2 weeks ago, I was up on tour on seeing some of our recent properties that came into inventory up in the Upper Peninsula. So if you know the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, it kind of looks like northern Maine. And so you get these properties, for example, we have abandoned mine properties, or contaminated sites which were timber cutovers and such. Those are those are examples of the properties we mostly get. However, we were very active with the NSP2 program, which some of you might remember, and we use that to help jurisdictions in Southeast Michigan acquire and demolish blighted and abandoned properties. And so we have a sizable amount of holdings in cities like Highland Park and Hamtramck in Southeast Michigan as well. And sites like this, which is in Muskegon Heights. You can raise your hand if you have a institutional building in your community that might look like this. It doesn't have to necessarily be a school, but it could be a former public building or public activity, which has moved on to other areas, but the public may not necessarily have the money to be able to deal with the removal of the structures or the repurposing of the sites. So this is another example where these properties come in or request is made for the state to assist, whether it's a local unit or whether it's a local land bank, to start the process to productive reuse. Our statute in Michigan enables counties to create land banks. It's an intergovernmental process. Effectively, if a county wants to form a land bank, they are permitted to do so. but as condition upon doing so, they can make communication to us, the state, and we enter into an intergovernmental agreement with them, which provides support, a process, and even dollar support to help them on projects. But in return, they are engaging in collaboration, working with the state through the foreclosure process. And so there's a good connectivity between the state land bank and local land banks in Michigan. About half of the counties, in Michigan have formed land banks to date. The city of Detroit is the only city in Michigan that's permitted to form a land bank. But a number of large cities have entered into agreements with us where we, in effect, become their land bank title holding agent to go. This map is filling out over time as locals, counties, and other local officials start to recognize the power of land banks, inclusive, but also in addition to that tax reversion process that I was referring to earlier. In many local jurisdictions, the foreclosure auction process, as we have in Michigan, seems to work well. Meaning that if I foreclose on a property for failure to pay back taxes, within the next 6 months, I might put that property out for an auction for bid, of which the highest bid is selected, and that's used to pay back the back taxes out of the delinquency fund, and then it puts the property for use. And that can work on functionally good properties and in functioning markets. But you can already see that there might be some gaps there, particularly on condition of building, condition of a distress, and also condition of market as well. And so a scenario that rises often is that properties cycle through that process. Somebody gets it on auction, and it returns around. I'll cover that in a graphic in the next slide after this one. Are land banks needed? Well, we've been talking around it, but in one slide, here's the reason. If you can divide this slide in half horizontally, in a stable neighborhood, a vacant property is most often reabsorbed by the market. It's vacant, but might want to come in and purchase that property because I want a home, or I know that I will be able to rehab or operate a commercial business out of it, and as such. So the normalized real estate system usually will bring these vacant properties into the market. But in weak markets, and I would add to that, with highly distressed properties, that's where the market process fails. Not because the market's not good, I mean, our market system is not good, but because you've got factors of distress which add up to a level where it accelerates the life cycle process or retards the ability of the market to successfully absorb that property. And as you might be familiar with the broken windows theory, if you have one or more of those conditions in the neighborhood, they have potential to accelerate that process at neighborhood scale, where vacancy leads to abandonment, might lead to blight, which might lead to foreclosure and dereliction. While that's happening, the local unit of government is seeing stagnant or less revenue, because not only is there little revenue coming from the properties, but the stagnation or perceived or real value that's identified through comps is decreasing values across the neighborhood or across the multiple neighborhoods in the community and city. And the third critical piece, which is a complicating factor, is what I'll describe as the eyes on the street philosophy. Most of you are familiar with that, which is the occupancy and existence of people in buildings and activity is one of the most significant deterrents to crime. Where there is not activity occurring is the higher propensity for crime to potentially occur. So you can see those three societal elements all revolving around the situation of vacancy that might start that cycle. So this next slide is intended to show, and does a good job of talking about, what happens to properties where the system is assumes that property gets foreclosed on and it gets sold on auction and it provides productive use to the community. When you have one or more of those factors I just described occurring, both physically and effectively or procedurally in a neighborhood, what the research is showing is that you have a higher volume over time of properties which simply cycle around. In other words, they might sell at an auction, but that property will come back likely because of the disinvestment or decision to disinvest or not invest based upon the one or more physical or neighborhood or community factors, of which it enters into the delinquency cycle again, and it compounds. And it compounds. And so if you can, in mind, picture this cyclical process going, and it increases on number of properties and increases in terms of velocity because properties might be cycling multiple times through to go. So land banks have a very specific power and capacity to stop that from happening, starting with being in a position where title clearance can be set up, can be affected, so that then the other distress factors can be arrested or dealt with to actually set the stage for it to be moved to productive reuse. Whatever that use might be it a community garden, be it a open space, a passive or park, or be it a rehabilitated or a new build residential or commercial activity. The reuse function harkens to and ties to the local community or the neighborhood's plans and regulations on what should be done for redevelopment. The land banking element here is to help set the stage, stop the negative cycle, and move the process forward in that interim phase to put to productive reuse. So to engage that ability to stop this negative cycle and reverse it, common powers to land banks are really not that different. I should back up. They are actually they are real estate, all the real estate powers that you can think of that a real estate entity or governmental real estate entity could have, plus these additional authorities that I have been talking about. So whether it being acquisition, holding, maintain, leasing, selling, securing, remediating, demolishing, rehabilitating, even construction on real property. In Michigan, all those powers accrue to land banks. The ability to acquire and convey, to even take rents on properties and sale proceeds. As I've mentioned, the power to clear title and extinguish delinquent taxes to properties. Make dispositions and collaborate. Those across most of the enabling statutes are fairly common.
Hey, Jim.
Yep.
We got a quick question from Ian. So could you elaborate on why state level land banking is critical? And we're going to talk about this more next week, but he goes on to say, local and regional land banks can address blighted property except for brownfield properties such as mill buildings. The state is the only one party that can address environmental liability and through that facilitate redevelopment. We've also got some more questions, comments that are longer.
Okay, well, I think I think I heard kind of a little bit of the answer to the question that was asked by Ian to go, which makes a lot of sense. The presence of a state role in land banking is not to usurp the local authority, but is in fact, at least the way we practice it, and we believe, and I would be recommending to any states considering, to support and provide a basis to assist locals in running through the elements through the process. And some of the examples I've shown in pictures and in discussion meet that. There are going to be properties in some communities, just be direct with you, because I came out of the local practice with what I do now, which are just beyond the capacity. They're beyond the financial capacity. They're beyond the physical capacity. They're on the dimensional capacity of a local unit of government or even a regional unit of government to be able to address them because of the scale. And that's where a state role can be very advantageous in support of or in conjunction with local activity or action. Here in Michigan, we have these large state facilities. Many states might be like us. We are exempt from zoning. the state of Michigan in its ownership and maintenance of properties. So there's a need to actually work through mechanisms once properties get surplused for redevelopment to work with the locals, and only the state can do that as well. So there is a role. I don't believe that, and I believe that role is to provide assistance and support and take lead to where necessary within that state local system.
Great. There's another sort of comment, more type of comment question. It comes from Andrew. So he says, I think it's pretty clear that this cycle is created because of capitalism. In the US, there are neighborhoods that have suffered vacancies, blight, contaminated properties because of systemic factors like racism and segregation. Today, we're still dealing with those factors. Until we can start to tackle the social justice aspect of those locations, we will continue to see gentrification and displacement of poor neighborhoods, many of which are home to people of color and other minorities. It's not a bad thing to revitalize communities, but we need to understand who lives in that community and what they want. This is the side of the conversation I don't see happening. Do you have any notes on that from Michigan? Or
well,
elsewhere?
That's a very apt comment, and my response for today would be agreed. But I think of it more of a, if I can use a baseball analogy, is that there are key issues which underlie some of the technical or factors that I've been talking about, and that are often at stage, and they need to be addressed in concert with the technical aspects or procedural aspects of how to do, because dealing with socioeconomic factors that surround land and recycling and redevelopment cannot be separated from the physical actions necessary to engage the redevelopment process or the setup process and such. So think of this more of in harmony. In other words, to get to second base, you got to get to first base first. If we want to be completely holistic in engaging in a mixed income, mixed activity, socially, economically, ecologically, and physiologically across all our neighborhoods, then we need to look at the system both in terms of effect, involvement, but mechanics. So today, I'm focused on showing you the mechanical side of this. The factors that feed into that are in discussions that might start today, but certainly pick up next week if we have this conversation. And then the practice that you all are going to engage, hopefully, from what you learned today. Other questions?
Nothing that I can see at the moment.
Great. All right, so what else can land banks do? Well, they can do a lot, depending upon what your enabling legislation says. Locally here, effectively, land banks are public sector real estate entities. And that last bullet is really critical, because there might be an activity or action or opportunity that doesn't fit the boxes. So that phrase, all other things necessary or convenient to achieve the objectives or purposes of an authority or other laws that relate to the purposes of a responsible authority, that is literally out of the statute, which is the legislature saying you can land bank engage to make your work happen, even if you don't have direct authority to do those things. Now, often it happens through intergovernmental agreements or other structures, but that language is very liberal and very powerful to allow for land banking and land banks to affect their roles. Now, again, this might be more focused here locally, but but I'm aware that most of the land bank statutes exempt its property from taxation. And there's a very critical reason why. It's because land banks should be seen and are recognized as interim property owners, and they are the public interim property owners. And so the need is to, and the opportunity is to move it from stage or setting A into productive reuse setting B. That is the purpose which provides the taxation and financial or fiscal fiduciary benefit to local units of government. quick primer there, the last slide. In Michigan, we have a few limitations. We're not omnipotently all powerful. We cannot do anything related to a casino, right? We cannot exercise eminent domain powers to condemn property. And this is kind of a trade-off for tax exemption, which is that land banks cannot levy a tax or special assessment on property. So the prime revenue raising function of land banks in Michigan is through what's known as the 550. That in a nutshell means, and that's the one act I showed in the previous slide, when a land bank sells its property to a accessible taxable situation, 1/2 of the property tax paid for the forthcoming 5 years is returned to the land bank as to raise revenue for that land bank. Okay, so what can a land bank property be used for? Well, in these parts, except for casinos, they can be used for anything. That's the purpose that I want to demonstrate here. Whether it's for side yard or lot expansions, or for new business and entrepreneurial startups, or talk about this coming up in a few slides, for renewable energy, or active or passive recreation property, or to put directly on the properties themselves or in concert with other properties for redevelopment or even neighborhood gardens. You can open your mind to think about what those properties can be used for, provided they fit your local planning and zoning regulations. There is no restriction generally on what land bank properties can be used for. How do land banks acquire property? This is going to be dependent on your structure, assuming that you authorize land banks or you have local unit authority at the municipal level to actually engage in property disposition and transactions, which effectively, like Ian has said, allows the municipality to actually engage in land banking. If it relates to, so I've divided this slide into 2 sectors. One is tax foreclosure. We've talked about that process a little bit. But the 3 main lines of disposition of properties out of tax foreclosure would be that pending an imminent foreclosure, an owner might decide to grant a deed in lieu of foreclosure to a treasurer to put into a land bank. Or once foreclosure occurs, there might and are mechanisms for land banks to obtain properties prior to an auction, or there are mechanisms or strategies or elements to provide for properties that don't sell in auction if an auction is run, how that can go into a land bank at that point. So those systems or a process are tied to dealing with tax foreclosed properties. For non-tax foreclosed properties, it's open to just about any direction or intake mechanism that you can imagine, be it purchased, donation, exchange, assignment, and any other process, any other process that you can envision. There really is no limitation unless there is a statutory limitation. And to this point, I've not seen one in any of the statutes that I've looked at regarding land banking. So what does this mean? Well, here locally, here's what we're doing. We are talking to our counties about and encouraging them to consider having the land bank in their county effectively act as the land agent for the public sector, meaning that, back to your, in your mind, thinking this exercise, in your city or in your county or in your jurisdiction, how many properties are owned by the government or by a governmental entity that's probably really good at providing the services to the citizens, but they may not necessarily be really good at real estate, or because they acquired property but never developed a municipal facility, or they engaged in enforcement action and in fact got a deed in lieu of foreclosure, and so the local unit government owns the property. But because they are providing governmental services generally, they're not providing real estate services, those properties sit. So the idea of moving governmental properties into a centralized repository has a lot of merit. That doesn't mean that the governmental unit gives up control of the properties. The concept of land banking agreements is becoming more and more active, which means that if the city of Jim, wants to locate all of my surplus properties into Mandy's land bank, then what I would do is I would enter into an agreement whereby I simply would come to close and move title to those properties into Mandy's land bank, of which I still would have jurisdictional control over how they get disposed of. But because Mandy's land bank has centralized title ownership, it provides a real good basis to make disposition proactively or reactively better than if I own properties and Mandy owned properties and 3 other governmental jurisdictions own properties in the community. So that, for nothing else, is a streamlining mechanism which can provide benefit both transactionally as well as productively by the simple presence of the land bank acting as the public land agent. A growing use of land banks, or excuse me, of land bank property and brownfield property is what's being termed as bright fields. I know we've got some folks from New Jersey on today. Those folks are one of the leaders in this realm. The concept here is pretty straightforward. If you have a big, bad brownfield site, you might know of one. We have a few in our inventory. They're pretty big and they're pretty bad. And many of them are landfills, for example, which cannot take any new construction redevelopment activity because you've got a legally enforceable, environmentally required cap on that landfill to protect the materials inside from escaping, to protect the public health, welfare, and safety. So often those sites sit there. And those are just the landfill sites that are in the regulatory scheme of the state or the local government. Then there's the sites that are unregulated, unknown, dating back to the last century or the century before that, which are out there and nobody knows because of that, they often have no ownership and they have come into a land bank's inventory or a governmental unit's inventory as well. Those could be really interesting opportunities and growing practice is to put them for a use that could actually accommodate a landfill site, which would be a ballast system of solar panels arrayed and producing power to put onto the grid or to the local community or whatever source would want to pick that up. So the phrase that has been coined is a takeoff from brownfields called bright fields. And on the far right is a site here locally where a bright field project is being considered for that landfill, that utility company's storage facility is potential. Does that make sense? Solar, a utility company on its fly ash landfill makes a lot of sense. On the left side is a representation of what could be any large parcel, which for one or more reasons cannot take a built structure redevelopment area. It could be, in this example, an airport property, which has to have clear vision zone, but only requires 100 or 150 foot clear space zone next to the runway. So that's an opportunity for perhaps an alternative energy project that could allow for some sort of lease or control to a local land bank. That's that site on the left, or that picture on the left side of the site, is an airport that's in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that is going to be done. That's exactly what's going to happen to it. The areas that are in clear vision but not clear development zones will be easement controlled by the land bank, and it'll be converted into solar development. So those are some unique uses that could be considered for these sites, which come about not exclusively, but driven in many cases by having land bank and repurposing and redevelopment opportunities. I know I have some people in this program today that are already familiar with the Incremental Development Alliance. And this is not a plug for them, but maybe it is a plug for them. Or actually it's a plug to the—
Yeah, make it a plug for them.
Yeah, okay. It's a plug for the concept as well. One of the common pieces of information I get often is by land banks is we've got properties and nobody's coming to get them. That's a conversation we can talk about, or we will talk about in their part 2 next week. One of the reasons from our partially anecdotal and partially researched base is that in many markets, the developer industry has bifurcated, and it's bifurcated to that most of the developers, if they exist in the market, have gone to medium or large size scale. They want to do large volume projects because they are corporations, they have overhead, they have a need to cover their costs to do that. And so 1Z, single lot, or 2Z, 2 lots in a neighborhood will never present enough overhead generation capacity for a large scale developer to go in and develop. Ergo, it'll sit in a land banks repository. But if the market is structured, or if the process structured so that people in the community, perhaps one or more of those neighbors that want to have the opportunity to develop or redevelop, perhaps in those low demand or distressed neighborhood communities, that the concept of manufacturing developers has a real positive alignment with land banking, because those developers that are manufactured and taught on how to do rehab or even new build on the small project scale have a ready source of lots right in front of them if the land banks are participating in that process. That's why this relationship of land banks to small scale development has a tremendous amount of potential. And to the Mainers that are in this call, if you engage a higher level of enabling legislation or practice in terms of land banking, and I see Manny shaking her head, I know you're already thinking about this, having small scale development teaching and training aligned with your land and property availability is a really good positive mix to have.
We don't want to give away too much right now, but we are bringing the Incremental Development Alliance to Maine, hopefully in September. So if you have any questions about that, check first Incremental Development Alliance's website. I'll post it in the chat, and then contact Build Maine if you want in.
All right, thank you. Excuse me. Where does the money come from to do all this stuff? It's about as cross-funded as you can see on this slide. There are many sources. Different states designed upon their structures, the structure in their enabling statutes might provide funding a structure for land banks, such as I mentioned this 5-year 50% of property tax here in Michigan. Other states might do a different structure, and or the capacity exists because land banks often or most time are quasi-governmental or public entities, but they can be set up as receiving either general or special fund allocation locally, having access to state funding and state support. Federal access is now hardest hit, and the mortgage settlement, those are perhaps more recent past funding sources, but federal funding programs, the formula programs such as the home or CDBG program tied to development project could be sourced for land bank to be a subrecipient under agreement with a local unit of government or even the state. Philanthropic or foundation support, of course, the rent and sale revenue that land bank might get as well. We're going to discuss next week another what I'll call delicious alignment, which is what happens when you line up land banking with tax increment financing. That is potentially legal right now in about 20 of the states, and except for a few, I'm not sure that it's really understood by the state authorities, the state leadership, as well as the local practitioners. I think there's some knowledge in Maine about this. I've been talking to a number of y'all about it, but I think there's some room to actually accelerate and build on that to be a more robust connectivity. And that'll be our conversation we have next week. But you can have, or there are multiple sources, and to the extent that, as I said, a land bank is a public sector real estate entity, the business model could and should perhaps be structured to be multiple sourced to run the development and the administrative operations of land banking, which we could or would be scaled to the size and the benefit and the activity of that land bank. Okay, so I don't want you to go blurry-eyed here, all right? I literally wanted you to understand how environmental liability attaches or doesn't attach to land bank. What you have in front of you in language is out of the Superfund, EPA Superfund CERCLA guidance with regards to how they treat land banks, which is more or less no different than local unit governments that acquire properties involuntarily. I'm going to read this language for you, to you, even though you see it, because you need to drop this in the back of your mind. I've heard this question dozens of times. So the federal statute provides that a unit of the state or local government will not be considered an owner or operator of contaminated property, which means that they are exempt from liability as a PRP if the state or local government acquired ownership of the property involuntarily, and read land banks into that as well. I'll describe, we'll now describe involuntary acquisition, which includes a non-exhaustive list of examples of acquisitions, including getting property through bankruptcy, abandonment, tax foreclosure, or other circumstances for which the government entity acquires title by virtue of its function as a sovereign, okay? However, it's important that this exemption does not apply in the situation where the government unit or the land bank has caused the release, meaning they are an actual contributor to the contamination of hazardous substance to a facility. Now that's the language. Here's what it looks like in a simple table. And it focuses on this. Land banks, by and large, are exempt from environmental liability, both under CERCLA and most all of the state environmental statutes, at least those that have shifted from strict joint several liability to causation liability. And I believe Maine is in that realm, that you guys are a causation liability state. So that means that if a land bank comes into being and takes property through any of tax foreclosure, bankruptcy, escheat, sorry, my slide, I need to move my box because I can't see the slide up there, or abandonment, that all those conditions are considered to be involuntary, and as such, you would not be a liable party for cleanup. Doesn't mean you don't have to deal with due care of how you manage the property, but the PRP status or potentially responsible party does not attach to the land bank in those acquisitions. If a land bank makes a voluntary acquisition, I, Jim Tischler Land Bank, am going to purchase or take direct assignment from Mandy Land Bank of a property for productive reuse, then more than likely I am required under statute to undertake what is the all appropriate inquiry due diligence process, phase 1, phase 2, certify that you're not a contamination before you take control or immediately upon taking control of the property. I don't want to get too much further in the weeds because some of you might be not familiar with environmental law and might be not wanting to get familiar with environmental law, but you have to recognize that there are protections for land banks built essentially on the interim ownership structure and taking property involuntarily as a means to move from stage A temporarily over to stage B. Now you can get out the test, Mandy. I'm teasing you guys. All right. There are a few entities that locally or even regionally that can provide.
Hey, Jim. Sorry, this is Ian. I was just unmuting myself. This discussion, I think, is critical in the state of Maine related to those circular laws. This is very vague currently, and I think it's my opinion, and we've talked about this too. I don't believe that local governments, as the laws are currently written, have strong enough liability provisions in there, and that's why I still keep on going back to the requirement, the need for a state level land bank, because that's the only way you can guarantee those adequate protections. Yeah.
That's a good point. I appreciate you bringing it up, Ian. We have talked about that. to the extent that I can be of assistance to you all in helping you with that, I am more than ready to do it. From as a practitioner, having been in the world of this for a fair amount of time, the concept of strict liability, meaning anybody who is in chain of title considered a responsible party. The intent is defeated by the reality of what it does is it freezes property to be never reused again much of the time because of the fear of suit or fear of challenge. And there are methods and mechanisms such as a causation liability tied to involuntary acquisition, land banking, such, which can address a situation. So I'll say I look forward to working with you all or helping you all find ways to make that happen in Maine or in your state or your area. If that's an issue as well, I'm certainly willing and interested to help you all as well. So this is, I think I have just a couple more slides here. The Center for Community Progress which formed in and around the scenario that unfolded with the city of Flint and Genesee County prior to the Great Recession, but accelerated during the Great Recession. Originally founded as the Genesee Institute, now is the Center for Community Progress, is perhaps one of the principal locations of resource for you for information and for documentation, for research. If you want to get more knowledgeable on this, their website is listed here. They are just tremendous. They are one of the cornerstones of the land banking movement. And we believe that it's in part due to their efforts and folks like Congressman Kildee and others that are at the center that have really launched this movement to be more than just a repository and dealing with problem properties, but redevelopment focused. Again, we'll talk more about that in our second part program next week. So to summarize, the key elements of land banking. It is an alternative, and I'll say it's a critical alternative to the problematic process of tax reversion and built upon that speculative auction process, which keeps many neighborhood properties going around and around and around in a circle. It can generate and does generate predictable outcomes that are tied to what the community wants to see happen. It does require financial support, as we discussed, and that support usually rises proportional to the scope of the scale of the property. Where there is the ability to connect to tax foreclosure, it would be our recommendation that perhaps tax foreclosure processes be modified, considered for modification in order to make land banking and transition of property more effective and streamlined, while still protecting the private property interests of owners. Okay, that's a comment that has come up, I've seen in the past, which is that land banking usurps private property rights. I'm skeptical of that statement because our system relies upon an owner of property paying taxes to receive the services of the government. And when there's a failure in process to do that, then there should be consequences in the failure process to pay property taxes. Tying to local land use and neighborhood goals is a critical element into the process. And as we heard in the question earlier, I'm thinking back in my mind about that. It was very, very appropriate. What is the level of community support, acknowledgement, engagement, and inclusion within the process to which a land bank activity or land banking can be the mechanism to affect that change or that benefit? That's where the leveraging of the social and the economic, along with the practical and technical and mechanical elements, come together to make land banking work. That's it for my slide today. I see that there have been a number of questions by the orange box lighting up, Mandy, so I'll be ready to handle whatever you bring to my direction.
It's a lot of comments too, so I would encourage everybody that's on the chat function, not driving or anything, to check out the comments. But Ian's last question was regarding foreclosure. Multiple owners, foreclosure laws don't support addressing. Sorry, Ian, you want to take this?
Yeah, it was related to that last image you had up, Jim. You know, land banks and the tools that we have available currently in Maine regarding properties that are in foreclosure or not in foreclosure. So the land bank, you know, doesn't necessarily acquire the property, but you've got really, we only, you know, we've got these two options, either to rehab a property or demolish a property. Demolishing a property is actually quite easier. It's a lot easier in Maine because given the laws available, because the rehabilitation and letting the tax foreclosure process proceed takes about 3.5 years. So, you know, to address a blighted property, it's actually easier to demolish. Would the fast track, you know, clearing title help address that and speed it up? I find that banks have been very willing partners in this process because they would like to clear a lot of these properties from their books, but they simply don't have the laws to support that. So when we process one of these, we find that the banks are supportive, but they're also passive because they know the outcome. They know they see a light at the end of the tunnel when Sanford proceeds with addressing one of these blighted properties. But when you see that there's, you know, no way out for them, meaning, you know, there might be multiple mortgages on the property, you know, there's multiple liens on the property, the title is completely unclear because it's been assigned, the mortgage has been assigned all over the place. You know, that's just a question that you know, it gets back to that tax foreclosure question,
Yeah.
but I'll leave it there.
I would, great comments, great question. And my response is yes, and you should be strategic. All right. In other words, going back to thinking through systematically how a property goes through the domicological cycle. All right. That's why I led with that. And back to the group that you got going in, I think I'm going to recommend you think through that way, or other folks on this webinar think through that way. In other words, a land bank is but a big piece, but one piece of a systematic progression or a cycle has to happen. So often the discussion or approach to dealing with land banking, moving to repurposing, has to include how properties come into land bank up front, which in a number of states has meant we need to deal with our foreclosure system. Okay. Now in Michigan, the fast track system, not perfect, but it seems to, it was arrived at as a way of more or less saying this: okay, all you interests in property, we're going to run a process, and if you want this property, then you come into court and you tell us why you should have the property. But in addition to you coming into court, you're going to explain and commit on the spot of what you're going to do to make this property good. All right. And so what happens often, because perhaps with some people who want to have interest in property, speculators, for example, the speculation system is, I want to get an interest, I want to sit on that interest, see how long I can go, Well, the fast track system in Michigan was in part intended to say to the speculator who wanted to get interest in title, okay, you want interest? Now get into court, tell us you're going to do something and commit to it. And if you don't do it, you're going to lose your control of the property. So that discussion of the foreclosure process, of how it moves into interim status, might be a parallel discussion that you guys all get going, tied to your land bank legislation.
So we've got a couple more questions, and I'm cognizant of time. I think we have about 5 minutes left. From Stuart, do you ever bundle properties and sell auction with conditions such as banks, mixed good loans, bad loans?
Yeah, good question. And the answer is yes. In the Michigan system revolves around auctions, at least a foreclosure system. And so a practice that's growing with a number of the treasurers who are by law on members of the land bank board, is that to move properties to the land bank, what they will do is they will bundle multiple properties for the auction with requirements, which could include bonds or upfront funding and commitments to perform within a period of time. Else they will lose title to the property back to the treasurer and it go back into the system. So that if you are running an auction process in your state, then you have that ability to, unless you're restricted statutorily on how the auctions are run. I'm not sure any state does that. That you could actually do that, and bundling, I think, is a good strategy.
Okay, and one more question from Reno. Jim, or actually a couple more. Jim, do you see land banks also playing a role as a development corp? As you mentioned before, properties are out there, but people aren't taking them. Inc. Dev aside, what role can the land bank play in acting as the developer itself?
That will vary based upon local application. My opinion is that land banks in fact are real estate entities, and where the market fails to act to develop, or the market does not develop what is needed or appropriate, my core philosophy is that the government should step in and be the developer, provided they act like a developer, understanding the land market product elements related to real estate development. And in that context, a land bank corporation approach is probably the best structure, in my opinion, to do that, because all the other governmental organizational constructs which exist, Michigan or otherwise, are mostly built upon reacting to what the private market is proposing, whether it's TIF or whether it's zoning incentives or whether it's whatever it might be, is that the government structure is designed to react or streamline or support what the private market wants. But if the private market's not delivering, well, because there is no private market to deliver, or because they are delivering something that the government, the community doesn't want, there is an opportunity, or I would say in some cases, the obligation of the government to step in and fill the role as a quasi-developer. Land bank structures are an express vehicle to deliver that.
Awesome. Well, that's all we have for questions. We are so thankful to everybody that joined in today. Thank you so much to Jim, as always, for giving his time. And tune in next week. We're going to have a sort of Land Bank 2.0. Is that right?
Land Bank 2.0. What we're going to do next week is to talk about some of the operational or procedural examples of how Land Bank can set the stage and participate in redevelopment activities. Here locally, we like to think of redevelopment, be it brownfield, obsolete, blighted properties, and land banking as one holistic development approach. And that's what you'll hear next week. And I believe Ian is going to present and just talk about some of his local examples so that the Mainers that are on this call or in this webinar can get a sense of what's happening in your own home state.
Awesome. Great. Thanks again to Jim, and we're Build Maine, and huge thanks to Maine Development Foundation and Ball at Maine Downtown Center. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot us an email, connect@Build Maine, and then Jim's is on the screen. So see you next week. Thanks so much.
Have a great day.